Hello and welcome back to Tried and Tested Cycle Coaching. Today I want to talk about two things. The first one is ramp tests, and then the second one is zone 2 training. So with zone 2 training, there seems to be quite a bit of even more press than there has been over the last few years around how it's, or how it might not be the holy grail that everyone thinks it is to greater fitness, and that in order to increase mitochondrial biogenesis, zone 2 might not be as effective as zone 3 or zone 4, etc. So I wanted to just give my take on how I think zone 2 fits into someone's training schedule. And as ever, it all depends, as they say. But anyway, let's kick off with the ramp test first. So why do a ramp test? I think is the obvious question. And this is something that came up the other day, which has prompted me to talk about this. Someone I coach, I scheduled some training for them, and I put in a ramp test. They'd had a couple of weeks off the bike, and it's always good to see where you're at in terms of your current fitness levels, especially if you're coming into a new block of training after having some time away. So, but it's a good question because usually, as he pointed out, I would schedule a 20-minute effort because I think it's probably a little bit more reliable in estimating someone's threshold power. But even then, obviously, a 20-minute effort can have its flaws depending on the percentage you take. Do you take 95%, 92%? So yeah, a ramp test for me actually provides a little bit more information potentially than a straight 20-minute test. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's good to incorporate that. I mean, the other thing as well is that aside from your experienced athletes who are pretty good at pacing a 20-minute effort, a ramp test is actually quite easy for someone who might be new to training as well. So that's when you might actually bring a ramp test into play, because you don't have to think about pacing that sort of effort. It's all that's taken away, and you just ride basically as hard as you can for as long as you can. So it's good in that sense. It's also quite repeatable. So from a mental perspective, doing a 20 plus minute effort can be quite daunting, whereas a ramp test, you're really only going hard for the final 5, maybe 6 minutes. So it's fairly repeatable from that perspective. The other question that comes up regarding ramp tests is their accuracy and their validity in terms of determining one's threshold power or FTP. And that is a good point. But as ever with all tests, they're all an approximation. So it also depends on how you interpret the test, and also knowing the individual that's doing the test and having some kind of idea on their phenotype. So if we take a sprinter versus, say, a time trialist, for example, a sprinter will have more anaerobic power. So a ramp test is probably going to favour them slightly more than a time trialist in terms of the last minute power that they're able to achieve relative to their FTP. So that's when you need to understand the person doing the test. So rather than taking the standard 75% of the last 1 minute power, for a sprinter you might only take 72% or even 70%, whereas the time trialist, it could be the other way. It could be that you take, 77 or even up to 80% of their final 1 minute power. So again, I think with any testing, it needs to be taken into the context of their overall kind of levels of fitness and their strengths and weaknesses, and ideally you would build out over time, their power profile, and that from that you could then determine where they would probably sit. So 75% is typically the average. So if you took 10 people, 5 of them would probably sit quite nicely in the 75% bucket, but there'll be outliers, depending on their fiber types and their mix of fast and slow twitch muscles, etc., and their ability to use glycogen, their rate of glycolysis, etc. So yeah, that would always need to be factored in terms of the test. In terms of the actual test protocol itself, there's various different ways that you can do a ramp test, both in terms of the length of each step, i.e. is it 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, etc., and similarly the rate of increase. So is it 15 watts, 20 watts, 25 watts, or some of them might even be a bit higher. I think the key thing is to understand the level that you're at, so the likely power that you're going to kind of top out at, and also how long you've been riding and training for. So assuming you've been doing it for a number of years, you're reasonably fit and strong, I think the standard protocol of 20 watts each minute is probably a good place to start. I think the key thing though is to be consistent with your testing and don't chop and change the protocol just because you want to achieve a certain number. At the end of the day, this is just to give an approximation. And I think as long as you stick to the same protocol over time, you'll then be able to see whether you're improving or how, where you need to work on certain aspects of your fitness. So yeah, I would always say just stick to the one protocol. In terms of preparing for a ramp test, I think what you want to make sure is that you're well rested before doing a ramp test, at least so you can get the most out of yourself, because you're going to be going very deep. You're going to be hitting probably, ideally your maximum heart rate in that final 1 minute. So if you go into the test with any sort of lingering fatigue, or you're not feeling 100%, you've got a cold or whatever, then I'd kick it down the road and do it on another day. So yeah, at least a day off or a couple of easy days. Just make sure the legs are feeling pretty fresh. Also make a note of when you do the test, so the day of the week, the time of day, and what you've eaten before the test, how many coffees you've had, etc. Because all of those external influences can influence the outcome of the test. So if you can kind of keep those consistent from one test to the next, then you're limiting the impact of those external factors on the outcome of the test. The other thing that I think is critical to getting the most out of yourself during a ramp test is to ensure that you're fully warmed up. Now, some of the ramp test protocols that I've seen, particularly on the likes of Zwift, there is a kind of 10-minute leading before you hit the first ramp, but usually the effort level required is too light, and I don't think you really go hard enough to warm up the all the energy systems. So I like to do a kind of a ramped warm up where you might start easy for the first 5 minutes, and then there'll be like 2 minute blocks where you're kind of going through the motions. So you kind of go through each of the zones. So you're then zone 2, 3, 4, and then your kind of heart rate's getting close to threshold, and you then might do a few short 10-second sprints to really sort of open up and get all the muscles firing. So I'd say at least a 20-minute warm up before you even start the ramp test itself, just to make sure that you can get the most out of yourself. The other final piece that you want to ensure is accurate and that is the equipment that you use to record the data from the ramp test. So here I'm referring to the smart trainer, watt bike, power meter, whatever it is that you're using. Just ensure that the data that you're getting from that device is accurate, and therefore when you do the test again, you're pretty confident that the numbers that you're going to get are going to be, consistent with the previous test. I've seen a lot of indoor trainers that give pretty inaccurate readings. So the other thing you can do, which I do personally, and quite a few of the people I coach do, is that they dual record. So they'll do the test on Zwift, say, with their smart trainer, but they'll also have a secondary power meter on their bike, so either pedals, crank, whatever, and they'll record the data from that device to their Garmin. So you've effectively got two recordings. That way you can also see what the discrepancy is between your trainer and your power meter that you're likely to use on the road. And therefore you can kind of adjust for any variations in the power. So you just make sure that, that aspect of the test is consistent from one test to another. As I said at the outset, the other thing that a ramp test can help identify, other than the threshold power, which is obviously the main reason for doing the test, but you do get a little bit more information potentially as part of the overall test. So if we look at this test result, which was done a couple of weeks back, and if we just focus in on the heart rate profile for the moment, we're not really interested in the power, although you can see that, the power is the grey chart. So the heart rate is this red line, and I appreciate it is quite lumpy and bumpy. So to the naked eye, it probably doesn't really tell you a lot, but if you kind of focus in on a couple of areas which I've highlighted, you can then start to get a little bit more of a sense of how this particular athlete was responding to the demands of the ramp test. So if we look at the initial ramp in the early stages, aside from these lumps and bumps, if we was to smooth this out, this line would probably be fairly consistent over time. But then all of a sudden you do see a slight plateau here before it then kicks up at a slightly higher rate than the initial ramp. Now this here for me suggests that this is the first inflection point, i.e. your VT1 or LT1, just before the heart rate then starts to accelerate upwards. You can see that by the angle, like I say, the steepness of the climb. And then after that, the heart rate then does settle down again, and the rate of increase becomes less pronounced for a period of minutes. And then you'll see, and this is less obvious actually, this second point, but you see a slight plateau, and then the heart rate it accelerates up at a slightly higher rate. And I think this is probably, knowing the athlete and their kind of physiology and their kind of threshold power, if you like, this probably does represent around their LT2, or the point where they're kind of transitioning from that heavy domain into a more severe domain. And then towards the end, you can also see that the heart rate, the rate of increase, starts to flatten off as they're reaching their kind of maximum heart rate, their maximum oxygen consumption. They're now into VO2 max territory. So if they was to stop here and carry on at the same intensity, they probably wouldn't last for much more than, say, 8 to 10 minutes. It would be my guess at a level. Obviously the ramp rate does continue upwards and then they eventually fail. But from this, you can then get a sense of where your zones might sit relative to what the test, the final 1 minute FTP test tells you. So I would say that the top of this person's zone 2 probably is around here, and then the top of their zone 4, i.e. their anaerobic threshold, if you like, sits around this level, and anywhere in between is going to be effectively tempo and sort of sub-threshold. The other thing that you can look at over time and compare one test to another is where these inflection points occur. So it might be that you top out at the same power or very close to the last test at the same power, but you might notice that your heart rate relative to power at the first inflection point has moved along a little bit. So it might sit further up and be a bit closer to your second inflection point. And similarly, the second inflection point might be a bit closer to the point where you top out. So that can then be quite telling and informative in how you might approach your training in subsequent periods. So it could be, in the early base period that you've done a lot of endurance or zone 2, zone 3 tempo work. And as a result, you've managed to push up your first ventilator, your LT1, but your LT2 is sitting in the same sort of zone or in the same part of the test. So that might suggest that you then need to do a bit more work around threshold, some over and unders, or even, some VO2 max work to kind of elevate your ceiling a little bit. So yeah, I think digging a bit deeper into the test results is always quite useful. Okay, so a quick recap on the ramp test. Firstly, take it for what it is. It's an approximate test that can be repeated regularly if needed. It's not a test of your worth as a human. Make sure you warm up well, so usually I'd say at least 20 minutes, and that you're consistent in your approach to the test. So that's in terms of the protocol itself and also the timing of the test. So the day of the week, the time of day, and also what you consume food and drink wise pre-test. Use the same equipment for each test so the data is comparable, and then try and dig into the data a little bit more after doing the test. Don't just take the power number for the last minute and then assume that that's all the information you can get from the test. As I said, it can be quite informative beyond that. Also, question the result as well. Is 75% of that final minute what you could hold in a TT type effort for, say, 40 or 50 minutes? If it's not, then just take it down a little bit. And then, or what you could do, and what I sometimes do myself, is then validate that test with a 20-minute effort, just to see how the two numbers compare. So now on to zone 2 training. Okay, so this is a massive topic and we could go down all sorts of rabbit holes with this one. But the two key things I wanted to focus on are, is it the most effective form of training for endurance athletes? And how should you factor zone 2 into your program or schedule? As ever, the answer to both of these questions is it depends on the context. I'm not sure why, but zone 2 always seems to be the modality of training that gets the most airtime. And most recently, the pendulum does appear to be swinging the other way. So a recent study, it was a narrative review published in the journal Sports Medicine back in June of this year, found that zone 2 isn't the most effective way of increasing mitochondria biogenesis, which is kind of the reason that it's widely touted as the main reason to do zone 2. So let's target that first question. Is it the most effective form of training for endurance athletes? From a purely mechanistic perspective, higher intensities provide a more potent signal. In simple terms, the purpose of any training, be it strength or endurance, is to create some sort of disturbance to your homeostasis, which then creates a strong signal for your DNA to make a more optimal version of you somewhere down the line. So zones 3, 4 and 5 are going to provide more training stimulus than zone 2. However, the real genius of incorporating zone 2 is not in its individual potency, but its role in a sustainable high volume ecosystem that allows you to absorb and recover from those higher intensity sessions. So this study might be correct in this kind of one area, and that is increasing mitochondria. However, it doesn't get to the heart of how zone 2 fits into a wider program of training, particularly for, high performance or dedicated endurance athletes. So let's dig into this a little deeper. We know that zone 2 helps underpin and support the training of those higher zones. You just can't do zone 4 and 5 all the time. You'd quickly burn out. I think the question we need to ask is, what is zone 2? For some people, it's riding easy and just floating around. However, my personal take on this is a bit different. And you can see this in some of the professionals who share their training data. I think gone are the days of just sticking it in the small ring and going out and doing these 4, 5 and even 6 hour rides. The pros are now riding most of their endurance rides right on that kind of VT1 or LT1 threshold, and often, going a little bit into zone 3 for short periods. They're basically maximizing every hour that they train. And I think UAE are a great example of this, and that's why they're probably so dominant. They train at the lower end of the volume in terms of, overall hours, but every ride they do basically counts. So zone 2 done like this is actually very demanding, but not so that it can't be repeated most days, and allowing for more intense sessions to be sprinkled in. So I think the key with zone 2 is to do it right, both in its execution but also its frequency, and to think about where it sits in the overall program. If you've got 2 or even 3 hard sessions in the week, or in your block, whether it's 7 or 10 days, then you're limited with what else you can do. What you don't want to do is just ride in zone 2 blindly and assume you're going to get stronger. Yes, if you've just jumped off the couch, having never turned a crank, then zone 2 will be all that you want to do for at least, a good few weeks. However, if you're a seasoned athlete, then you need intensity. It's as simple as that. I think people like zone 2 because it's comfortable, and we all like being comfortable. Riding hard can be daunting, and often, you go to dark places, but ultimately it's that training that will make you a faster bike rider. In terms of how you might structure zone 2 into your training can also depend on where you are in your overall training periodization. Assuming you might race or compete, then I think zone 2 volume as a proportion of your overall training becomes higher during the race season as you adopt a more polarized structure. You want to be relatively fresh for your races, so doing lots of training in those higher zones will counter that objective. However, during the off season and over the winter, I'd be inclined to adopt a more zone 3 centric approach. Zone 2 probably still making up the lion's share of the volume, but not to the same degree. Also consider the number of hours you have available to train. If it's less than 8 hours, and your longest ride is typically on the weekend, then I don't think it makes sense to do more than a couple of zone 2 rides each week. One longer ride at the weekend and maybe, a shorter one during the week. The rest of your training can be higher quality sessions. So as you can see, there's lots to think about regarding zone 2, but just to recap, I think the key thing is that you want to execute it well, and don't mistake an easy zone 1 ride for a zone 2 effort. Zone 2 done properly should feel like you're doing some work. Assuming you are doing zone 2 right, are you, however, avoiding the hard work of zones 4, 5, etc., out of a misplaced belief in zone 2 supremacy? Or, you could be hammering yourself daily, leaving no room for the foundational work that makes it all sustainable. So it really is about finding that balance, and with that balance, I do think you will see your engine truly grow.